me while I get mic'd up here for the video. I almost forgot that, Emma. I'm sorry, that would have been a tragedy. Well, thank you very much, Brittany, for the wonderful introduction. In fact, I kind of feel like all I have to do now is just click through my images, because she kind of said it all, and you're going to hear that all again in long form. So thanks very much to Brittany and to Netta, who stepped out to get something, who've been awesome in hosting me here, and of course to Michael for inviting me and letting me come to your awesome campus and spend some time with you this week. I met with a painting class this morning. That was a lot of fun. They had awesome questions for me about my process and my ideas and about being an artist and showing in a gallery and all that sort of thing. So I'm very pleased to be here and very honored to be talking to you tonight. So I'm going to talk tonight, just give you a little overview of my lecture, because it's good so you can track how much longer it's going to go, right? It's only 200 images, don't worry. Yeah, 300. No, it'll only feel like 200 images. So I'm going to begin by talking about the foundation of the conceptual and formal dimensions of the work, focusing on those ideas that continue to have an effect on what I do. And I'll then talk a little bit about how those initial frameworks appear in the work and how they've been expanded upon and added to over the course of the past few years. Finally, I'll focus on not only some recent work, but a few things kind of in progress. So you get a little peek what's on the horizon. Don't get too excited because they're like blank panels. Since my work uses text, as you saw in the exhibition over there, it doesn't always show up really well in a projection. So from time to time, I might take the opportunity to sort of read a text to you so it gives some context to what I'm doing. To start with an overall statement of the work, my primary interest is in narrative. So I'm interested in the ways in which paintings can tell stories and the types of storytelling that are available to our contemporary moment. The narratives that I'm interested in creating involve the ways in which identity is formed by culture. In particular, I'm interested in how a certain kind of working class masculine identity arises from both mass and subcultural points of view. The images that I use are all appropriated. They're all sampled. We had a little copyright discussion in class this morning. We can talk off the record and off film later, my thoughts on that. Or you can appropriate it and distribute it and remix it and do like a cat video over top of me or something. That'd be awesome. In fact, I would really like for someone to do that. To put a cat video over my head would be brilliant. So they're executed in a variety of painting languages in an effort to create a web of references and allusions based on our culture. So while the images are essentially stolen, I write all of the text. And they're designed to undermine any potential machismo in the work. There are a lot of boy images, right? Black Sabbath, X-Wing fighters, hunting and fishing images. I'm not interested in making like, yeah, dude paintings. In fact, I kind of want to destroy that idea of making yeah, dude paintings. So that happens in the level of the text. The texts like undermine the potential machismo. And in the writing, the female characters tend to be in positions of control, power, authority, while the male characters are generally inept, injured, or mystified in their interactions with women. So I'd like to start with a few early influences. First, we have Vernon Fisher, contemporary artist from Texas, very well known for using appropriated images and text. And he was really important to me, particularly when I was in graduate school, because he really expanded my idea of what narrative painting could be. Prior to encountering Fisher's work, I might have more properly thought of narrative painting being like Caravaggio or David or something like that. But this idea that you could be using radically contemporary imagery and radically contemporary approaches to the picture plane and surface and things like that, and it still be considered narrative, was a real watershed moment for me. At the same time in graduate school, I was looking at artists like James Luna, who's a Native American performance artist. This is his piece, Half Indian, Half Mexican, commenting on how outsider culture might look at him depending on what their experience was. Michael Ray Charles, a contemporary African-American artist who deals with pervasive issues of assumptions about African-American identity by using this early 20th century racist advertising imagery. Cindy Sherman was someone I was really interested in, particularly the Untitled Film Still series, where she creates these sort of like female types as sort of an empty vessel that identity is projected into. Barbara Kruger, another sort of second-generation feminist artist who's very well known for using text juxtaposed with advertising, sort of vintage advertising imagery to make these really didactic sort of attacks on assumptions about class and gender and capitalism and things like that. So with the exception of Vernon Fisher, what's really struck me about the work of these artists was the way in which they shared an investigation into identity as formed by popular culture. And certainly we're all shaped by our experiences, and I was educated in the 90s. And there was a real focus in the 1990s on what generally came to be called identity politics in sort of a larger umbrella, I guess. And that was the movement of feminism, multiculturalism, queer theory, et cetera, into a more centralist position in art world discourse. So I really came to realize that my identification with these artists and my interest in that dialogue was really rooted in my own working class background. My dad worked for a federal prison. My mom worked as a bank teller. Neither one of them went to college. And so I realized that my working class experience really was my lens into appreciating these artists' work, because they were also dealing with sort of issues of how culture forms identity. The other really important source for me when I was in graduate school was Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. So I won't attempt to summarize Gravity's Rainbow because it cannot be summarized. I was telling a class this morning, it's notable for there not being a Nobel Prize of Literature awarded the year that it was published, because they were so radically divided on whether or not it was of worth for a Nobel Prize, so they didn't give it. So I guess it kind of got it in a backwards kind of way. But reading Gravity's Rainbow, such as it was, as hard as it was, it really led to a new approach in my work in terms of the complexity and trying to achieve, I mean, certainly I wasn't going to be able to do what Pynchon did because it's like crazy complex and researched. But it really raised the bar for me. So the novel itself takes place at the end of World War II. It follows a protagonist through the chaos of Europe in the last few months of the war and its aftermath. It brings together a vast range of characters, and it's crafted in a way that pulls together a huge array of references and approaches, including symbolic references to the Kabbalah and Teutonic myth, a myriad of writing approaches that you could see as analogous to formal approaches to work, formal conventions, such as straight narration, technical writing, historical novelization, all these different things sort of jammed together in this big, thick 800-page book. You move backwards and forwards in time, tracing different characters' lineages and the killing of the last dodo and all this crazy stuff. And really the complexity of Gravity's Rainbow, again, raised the bar for me in terms of what could be possible in the paintings. So it really elevated the ambition of the work, and it made me realize that the way in which I was dealing with images and sort of trying to construct these essentially postmodern narratives need to be far more complex. So this is the first, I consider this my first real painting, I guess, that I did after reading Gravity's Rainbow. Swarms of ants crossed the cement driveway from the front yard to a small mound of red dirt in the side yard. He sat in the cool shade of the garage. When a suitable number of ants had accumulated, he leveled the spray nozzle of the hose and washed them away in a single burst. He laughed, "Death from above," and patiently waited. So this is the painting that really establishes many of the initial formal and conceptual concerns of the work that really continues to have an effect on what I do even today. So this includes a dislocation of images, a variety of painting methodologies and types of execution, which includes screen printed type. So at this point I'm using silk screen to get the block of text on there. A text which is indicative of the tone, the length, and the approach that's been employed in the writing from across the work. It's also a very big painting. It's actually bigger than it's projected there. It's 9 feet high by 10 feet wide. It was important to me at the time to make big work, because before this I felt like I was making really bad work, and I was like, if it's going to be bad, it's going to be big. So if nothing else, they can't hit me for not being ambitious. So I have this chart, because I'm a big nerd. But I think it's really helpful in terms of me talking about how I approach my thinking. And a lot of these things that you see in here continue to influence my conceptual decision-making, my formal decision-making in the work. So I often use this, and I've said it to a few students today, to me the idea of being an artist comes down to the question of what do you want to say and how are you going to say it. So for me, my core interest is in narrative, as I said earlier. And then let's take a little look at sort of the form end of things. So I'm really interested in the idea of painting as a language, which comes from an interest in semiotics. So therefore, the work employs, again, a variety of approaches that run the gamut from the rendered, the schematic, the scrubbed out image, the incomplete image, basically a variety of permutations of what iterations are possible using paint. And it's one of the things I really love about paint is it can look like lots of different things. So it can look like screen printed. It can look rendered like Renaissance style. It can look like a graphic image. It can look like a screen. Like, I think the malleability of paint is really important to me because it allows me to imitate all these other cultural visual forms. And really, it allows me to connect it to a range of visual references. So secondly, I'm really interested in the viewer's role in the construction of narrative, which I draw from an interest in film theory. And if you notice in the work, the images never overlap. They're all like, you kind of have to like literally move your eyes around to put it together. In addition to the influence of film theory, I was also, I'm really interested in, and this also goes to the organization of elements, which are really a reaction against sort of the visual language of 1980s postmodern painting. So I love Vernon Fisher. I love that sort of build up of pentimenti and scrubbing things out, and they're gorgeous. But I felt like that was the language of the previous generation. And so if I was going to use appropriated images, I needed to figure out a way to use them in a way that felt like mine. So I sort of took that sort of overlay of 1980s appropriation work and sort of flattened it out. So that, again, speaks to the organization of elements. And then again, the narrative structure is very much derived from postmodern fiction. So it's both in the totality of the painting and the connection of paintings to one another and the work as a whole. So there are no proper names in the text so that they can be sort of types. They can be sort of you can project characterizations into them. And that really allows them to be flexible for me. And then on the content end, as I said earlier, I'm really, my driving interest, in addition to narrative, is this interest in the construction of masculine identity. And this really is arrived at through the influence of feminism and identity politics through the portal of class. So how I tend to frame this grows out of a book by an author named Michael Kimmel. And he has a book called Manhood in America that came out in the mid-90s. And it was pretty important because it was one of the first sort of looks at sort of gender-forming history in terms of masculinity. It's something that had happened a bit in feminism, but the same lens hadn't been turned on sort of masculinity in that way. So he established these three defining characteristics of American masculinity that I found helpful to kind of organize my thinking about this issue. So first is this idea of self-control, that rigor of holding oneself together in the face of adversity, temptation, opposition, et cetera. So in my work, it's embedded in the really tightly controlled grounds. I don't know if you noticed, but everything's pretty tightly controlled and anal retentive in my work, right? Like everything's really crisp and all that sort of thing. So for me, that's a way of sort of articulating that notion of self-control. The same self-control, though, is undermined by the bad things that happen in the text. So bad things happen to the characters in my text, to the male characters in my text. And basically, the male characters are at the mercy of another will. And again, that's an opportunity to undermine any machismo. Secondly, Kimmel talks about exclusion as an idea within American masculinity that there is a right way that you're supposed to be a man, which is ridiculous, but the idea that anything other than that is somehow lesser. And of course, depending on what your socioeconomic, racial, religious background is, that means different things, right? So he argues that what tends to happen in masculinity is that you argue for your point of view through the exclusion of other points of view. So the way you give yourself value is you try to put down something else. And we all have seen this in culture quite a bit, right? So in my work, I take a little bit different tact on that. I'm interested in more this idea of exclusion being a potential for articulating one's own identity through the lens of subculture. So the way you might really be into an obscure band and you like that the band is obscure, and if they get too popular, you don't like them anymore, right? Or that if you do like an obscure band, you get the shirt and you like wear it to the show. Or actually, you don't wear it to the show. Never wear the shirt of the band you're seeing to the show. You don't do that. We all know that, right? Okay. But you wear it to another band, and someone's like, oh, man, you got a shirt by that band. I didn't think anyone else knew that band. So there's like this exclusiveness to that I think it doesn't certainly only happen in masculine arenas, but I think in my own experience, it seems to be a highly adolescent masculine experience. this privileging of exclusivity. And then finally, he talks about this idea of escape. An example of this might be the pioneers of the gold rush, where there's a literal escape as we moved away from agrarian culture to more sort of industrialized culture. Literally, men left and went out west to find gold and lived in these like all-male mining camps, and they drank whiskey and fought each other and probably killed bears or something. I don't know. But in my work, I'm interested in sort of contemporary examples of that kind of escape, and I tend to think of it as things like partially the subcultural stuff, but also like video gaming, right? It's a very escapist sort of endeavor. So basically anything that creates a sort of perpetual adolescence, which we might see as sort of contemporary notions of escape. And then connected to both form and content, there's a real reliance in the work on intertextuality. So the shaping of the work's meaning by other texts, by other works. So those can include painting, film, novels, television, music, the new Call of Duty that's coming out next week, what have you. And I'm really interested in forming a web of references and allusions, both within the paintings and between the paintings, and then between the entire body of work and the world. So I really want to create this real web of experience between individual things and works, works to one another, the body of work to the world. And finally, the writing's influenced by writers like Raymond Carver and George Saunders, Kurt Vonnegut. Really, because it's a painting, I know no one's going to stand there for like 20 minutes to read it, because I wouldn't. So I know I have to use real economical language. I have to kind of get in there, get the text, and get out, because I know I only have you for like 5 seconds, right? Like people stand in front of artwork for like 5 seconds or something usually. So here we can see how some of these ideas started to play out in an early piece. This painting is called Short Hairs. And the dog image here is essentially a hunting image. And there's the Boy Scout drawing. I've used a lot of Boy Scouts in my work over the years. It's kind of like page 3 or 4 of the appropriation handbook. You do like first aid stuff. You do airplane manuals, which is up on the top. And then you do like Boy Scouts. And then there's some other stuff in there, I'm sure. Knitting things or instruction manuals. So we have the Boy Scouts, and they're images which really both frame and embody the idea that they're a set of dominant, stereotypical expectations regarding masculinity, and which are handed down from the previous generation. So here I was really kind of focusing more on expectation and inheritance. So the way in which these images that were more properly, although I remember my Boy Scout manual had these drawings in them too, but they were more properly belonged to my dad's generation or my grandfather's generation, say, and how their images and their sort of understandings of masculinity become sort of a weight on my generation's experience of masculinity, right? It becomes, you inherit these ideas, they become expectations for you, so you feel like you have to like football or something. I don't like football. I always felt like I got like, it's almost like you get your guy kit, right? And like I felt like my stuff didn't fit. Like, well, I like fishing a lot, that fits, but I don't like football, so that doesn't fit. I like to read books. That's not in here. So I always felt like there were some things that aligned with sort of expectations of masculinity, but there were a lot of things that didn't. Like I would rather like watch Thundercats than help my dad work on a car. To this day, I would rather watch Thundercats than help my dad work on a car. I should have listened though, because now I got to pay someone else to work on my car for me. So win and you lose. So here's just some installation views of my thesis exhibition. It gives you a nice sense of the scale of the work. Like I said, a lot of these paintings were pretty big, and that was important to me at the time because I wanted this sort of immersive experience. I was looking at film, I was looking at fiction, and one of the best comments I got from someone going through the show was like, boy, I really felt, actually 2 comments. One person's like, boy, I felt like I was like in a movie when I went in there because it's so immersive. And I was like, that's one. And then someone else, separate and later, said, boy, I really felt like I was like in a book. And it was perfect, honestly. So pretty big. One little note for those of you who may be working on your theses. So clearly I went down to the gallery and I measured the ceilings to make sure that I didn't make a painting that was too big for the ceiling. But I didn't measure the outside wall very well, did I? Because that like hovers, like, there's like 3 inches on top, 3 inches on bottom. And of course, you don't have enough time to do anything about it. So here we are, almost 15 years later, and it still bugs the crap out of me. I should Photoshop that out. What am I thinking? Okay. So moving forward a little bit, this is a painting that's actually from when I first moved to South Bend, Indiana. Yes, I live in South Bend, Indiana. Please don't be jealous. We had snow last week on Wednesday. Yeah. Hey. But here I'm still utilizing these sort of mid-20th century references to illustration. So we have the hunting image from probably the 1940s maybe, and the taxidermy image. But I'm also starting to increasingly use references to my own experience of masculinity. So the inclusion of the General Lee, right? I grew up watching Dukes of Hazzard, and so trying to make more contemporary to my experience examples of masculine tropes. Here's a painting I include. I actually really don't like this painting. I don't think it's a very good painting. But what's important about it is this down here in the lower right-hand corner. So this sort of spray-painted thing that says Slayer 90. And it includes a music reference here to the band Slayer in the form of that graffiti. And this, initially, it was supposed to just be an indicator of sort of my own kind of Rust Belt, Pennsylvania upbringing, where you'd see this something like this spray-painted on overpasses and things like that. The best one of these I ever saw was someone had spray-painted Copenhagen rules on a bridge, and I thought, boy, you really love Copenhagen, because you got a can of spray paint, you went to a bridge, and you wrote your love of Copenhagen to, which, I mean, I don't partake, but it must be really great stuff if you're willing to do that. But the other thing that happened in doing this is it made me start to think about other areas where this sort of complicated navigation of masculinity plays out. And specifically, it led me to thinking more about the realm of heavy metal. So Robert Walser's book, Running with the Devil, Power, Gender, Madness, and Heavy Metal Music, has been a pretty important touchstone for my thinking on this issue. It really provides a framework to view metal as a cultural form rooted in a working class tradition, and as an arena where mostly adolescent males can exist outside of normative pressures. The musical form and the rituals that surround it become a sort of societal release valve, a kind of escape. We were trying to my earlier ideas here. So, where's my thing? No, why isn't it playing? Oh no, don't do that. Oh, here we go. Seems important. This seems really important. Exactly. Yeah? I'll just let that play in the background because I know we want it to. So here we have an image of Eddie Van Halen playing his really famous guitar solo, Eruption, which I think it's pretty telling that the song's called Eruption. He's doing what he's doing and making faces like that. I mean, it's pretty like sexual, right? It's like pretty masturbatory, honestly. So in the book, Walser talks about virtuosity within the metal community as embodied by someone like Eddie Van Halen as being analogous to working class privileging of mastery over one's tools. So really privileging that you can fix up a car really well, valuing those sorts of things. So in my work, this aspect of virtuosity or technical facility as labor has really resulted in that heightening of the level of finish in a lot of the rendered images. Prior to sort of thinking about this, they would only get to a certain degree of rendering, certain degree of facility and finish, because I was looking at a lot of illustrational sources. So thinking about this, I decided I really need to up my game on how the rendered images are painted. So Walser's book has also enabled an influx of music references that really began with the inclusion of really obscure metal logos in the work, such as this logo. Can anyone read that? Bloodbath, yes. Which is, if you know, is a bit of a Swedish death metal supergroup, as it were. Such a thing does exist. And so including these images, I really was drawn to the formal qualities of the images, which sounds really funny to say. But I saw an equivalency between this and say the Boy Scout drawings that we saw earlier. So there's a sort of a formal equivalency in the work. So conceptually, they also function as subcultural forms that privilege obscurity and exclusion, and they become markers of formed rather than inherited identity. So here's how this plays out in a painting. This painting is called Endgame. The boy pointed and laughed at him, the slingshot now dangling limply from his right hand. See, I'm a hell of a shot, just like my old man. He looked blankly at the boy, blood running from his forehead. Where in the hell did that come from? The boy readied another rock, squinting as he aimed. See, I can do it again. He heard the whiz of the rock and felt another explosion on the side of his head. That's it, I'm gonna kill the little bastard. So the heightened rendering of the skinless logo, there's this literal collision of new and old masculine tropes reflected in the exchange between the young man, the boy and the man. And then in the scout image, we see this literal blurring of those traditional notions of masculinity which are handed down. So the blurring of the images there. My work is mostly painting and works on paper, but on occasion I've had opportunity to do installation-based stuff. So this is a big wall drawing. So it's 8 feet high by 360 inches in the corner. There's vinyl text in the corner. You can see how these ideas, no longer having a studio that's big enough to do giant 9-foot by 10-foot paintings, this sort of thing, when it pops, it's been a while, but when it pops up, I like to take advantage of it because it's a good way to kind of stretch out again. So if we jump forward a little bit further, this painting is called Cold-Blooded. So stemming from the inclusion of those metal logos, I started to develop further music references based on identity and subculture. So here we have the Old Dirty Bastard logo up here. And I really saw in this formal, again, a sort of formal equivalency. So Boy Scout drawing, death metal logo, Old Dirty Bastard logo. There's a formal continuity there that I was drawn to in terms of, again, talking about these ideas of masculinity. So this is also a really important painting for me, and it's going to be totally ridiculous to you, but check this out. Curve there. Everything else has been a block of text. Block of text. Blocks of text. But here, I curved the text, which seems really stupid, right? To all of you, you're like, yeah, okay, you curved it. But for me, it was like this huge breakthrough, right? Like, oh my God, I can deal with the text as an image. And not only did I curve the text, that is not Times New Roman. That is like a dot matrix text, people. So, I thought that it had to be like a block of Times New Roman equals text. And this is the first painting where I sort of finally, stupidly realized that that didn't have to be. And once I did that, it sort of really has started, the text has really changed and transformed. So here we have further examination, further experimentation with the shape of the text, as well as selection of typeface. And this is probably the last time I'll ever use screen printing in a painting. So all the text we've seen up to here has been me screen printing onto a panel or canvas, hoping it worked in one pool, and if it didn't, wipe it off quick, redo it. And that's a really stupid way to use screen printing, honestly. Screen printing is designed to make a lot of something. And it's pretty labor intensive until you get to the point that you can make a lot of something. It's really not great to do one of something. So what I did is I bought a vinyl cutter. So this is like a sign vinyl cutter that they make home desktop versions. It'll cut 24 inches wide. And initially, this was supposed to be a way to, again, impact my use of text, but it totally transformed the work. It introduces new processes for me rooted in digital technology for sketching and refinement. We'll see some examples of that here in a moment, of both in-progress works using Illustrator, Photoshop, and the sign cutting software. And it also really introduced my thinking about digital space, gaming, and the relationship between painting and technology, which is really integral to my thinking about my work these days. The history of painting and really the impact of technology on that history is really interesting to me. So if you think of the development of perspective and oil paint in the Renaissance, that impacted how paintings looked. It wasn't like Cimabue couldn't paint very well. and suddenly Leonardo can. It's like there were ideological and technical and perceptual changes that occurred. The camera, or the collapsible aluminum tube in the 19th century, that suddenly you weren't, the collapsible aluminum tube I actually find really fascinating, because prior to that, painters would have had to like mix up their paints. So you're not gonna like mix up these expensive things and then go out and risk them drying. You know, you could have like some animal skins and stuff to keep them wet and workable, but really the collapsible aluminum tube that I would have assumed was invented for like toothpaste or something, it was actually invented for paint. And so that allowed people to go work on site. So think of like Impressionism. They're also responding to the development of the camera. Suddenly you don't have to make something that looks like the world because there's something that does that better or more efficiently perhaps. Not necessarily in the 19th century, but you know, eventually. So that changed how paintings looked. There's also in the 19th century the development of all these new colors from the byproducts of the Industrial Revolution. There are new pigments available. So when you look at a painting from the 19th century versus a Renaissance painting, it's not like, oh, they suddenly like brighter colors. It's like, no, they suddenly had brighter colors. They had a broader palette to work with. And so I'm interested in how that sort of trajectory continues. And so I'm interested in how things like Photoshop and Instagram and all that sort of thing impact what's possible and what's maybe expected of painting. So I'm interested in digital space because so perspective is what we might call ocular space, right? It relies on our perception. Digital space, however, is algorithmic and computational. So the z-axis in a computer, it exists computationally and algorithmically in the computer, right? It's not a fiction, it exists in that space. So if you've ever played an open world game and you can keep on going, it's not like it's like tricking you. It's like you're literally, you are literally moving through digital space as a digital entity. In that way, it's literal. So here's just some examples of how the computer plays out. A mock-up of the painting that's in the show over here. So it started out as this Illustrator sketch. And then someone asked me this morning, usually I sort of start it and then take an image of it, which we'll see again in a moment, into the computer and figure out how I'm going to finish it. Here's an example where I sort of sketched part of it up first. So here's this is actually the first painting I did using the vinyl cutter for the type. So I did the type. But if you look right here, it definitely shows up in the projection. See how that looks like a bad JPEG? That's actually painted. So as soon as I got it, I was like, hey, I can make stuff look like digital space. And I never would have thought to do that with screen printing. I was just terrible at screen printing. I hated it. No offense to any screen printers. Like, it just didn't work for my way of working. So those sorts of things have become really integral to what I do. And it was definitely the getting the vinyl cutter allowed that to happen. Something like this, that sort of figure ground inversion on the type, where in the sort of overspray cloud, it's green. On the background of the green, it's white. I never would have thought to do that with screen printing. It just didn't see the process in that way. But using the stencils really opened up how I could approach that. There's also the development of this more saturated color. I don't know if you noticed, but some of my paintings are a little bright, a little saturated. The earlier work, if you notice, was pretty muted. Lots of grays and browns and greens and things like that. And part of that is because that's sort of the visual language of what I was thinking about in terms of mid-century inherited notions of masculinity. But with the introduction of using the computer and thinking about, again, this sort of digital space, it started to introduce me thinking about digital color, RGB color space, things like that. So that really led to the work, the color being really punched up in the work. So here's another painting, Slow Learner, starting to integrate these pixel fields, referencing early 8 and 16-bit graphics. There's also a little Mario over here. Doesn't show up very well, but it's painted like, little sprite. Right? It's called a sprite, I believe. Escape hatch. Again, we have this sort of the digital bad JPEG in the lower left-hand corner. It takes a lot of time to make a painting look like a bad JPEG, stupidly enough. But here, the music references evolve again, where instead of just having logos, I started to include these line-drawn images. So that's actually an image of Led Zeppelin in the upper left-hand corner. And Led Zeppelin's kind of interesting because like that's someone my dad would have listened to, but I grew up listening to them and I now love them. So some of it starts to create a little more like dynamic kind of liminal space between my dad's experience and my own experience. There are places where that starts to overlap, I think, for all of us. This painting's dark in person too, but there's a big death metal logo on the bottom. We have Straight Outta Compton, which is a reference to NWA. And then here, the referencing of digital culture isn't just in the way the work's made, but there's actually the little PlayStation 3 up here. So that's PlayStation 3 and the controller. So it's starting to make more literal inclusions of that sort of reference. That type is actually, I tracked down what typeface they used on the single of Straight Outta Compton and used that actual type, which is also the same type they use in their logo for NWA. So again, this evolution, it all comes from the Boy Scout drawings, honestly. So it's Boy Scout drawings, death metal logos, Old Dirty Bastard, NWA. So there's like this sort of like evolution of how I think about the formal aspects of the images that I'm using. So there's also in this, and my thinking, and I've talked earlier about that working class privileging of a mastery of one's tools. So it introduced a new kind of technicality to the work, but it was a technicality not rooted in like I can make something really look like that Jabba the Hutt exists in space, but this pixelization. So it's a new kind of, for me it was a new kind of technicality rooted in the computer and the stenciling and the use of the airbrush and all that sort of thing. In 2009, I did a series of smaller text-based works, some of which are here. This is the first of those. Does anyone know where that pattern's from? Excellent. Yes. People don't always get that. It's from the guitar. If we had more time, I'd take you to this website, which is where they made replicas of his original guitar that he built, and they made like 300 of them or something and sold them for $25,000 each. But they replicated it to the point that it was hard for him to tell which ones were the copies and which ones were the original. Every cigarette burn, the actual reflectors, the quarter that he drilled into the face of it to keep the bridge from falling down, which to me seemed like a particular kind of masculine obsession. But here's some process shots. So you can see I started out with the black panel, laid the white stencil on top of it, painted it white, peeled that off, laid another level of stencil there on the second row, painted it red. That all came off, put a layer of the vinyl type, painted that, and then we have this painting. So I like to include this shot because I think sometimes not everyone's really familiar with vinyl type and vinyl lettering and how that might be used. So hopefully this kind of helps illuminate what I mean when I say that. So initially I never thought these paintings would leave the studio. I was looking at a lot of contemporary graphic design, really thinking about again, the ways in which images exist in our contemporary world. And I had also started teaching at Notre Dame, which has a really great graphic design program, and I had to suddenly be conversant in design with students, and I had no training. So I started reading books and things like that, and I was really struck by the possibilities of what I could use in painting. So I did this whole series of pieces. Initially, they were just supposed to be like, what can I do using the vinyl cutter? What sorts of things can I do with color and type? I thought they'd just be like studio experiments that never went anywhere. But I ended up doing enough of them that I really kind of liked them. And I liked the way in which they sort of articulated my ideas in a slightly different form without images. So they become sort of a parallel path in terms of the work. So I believe that one's over there, right? That font is called Slayer font, of course. Dealing with like optical things, like what happens when I put like neon green on soft pink. It really hurts your eyes is what happens. So here you can see a little bit bigger painting where those experiments start to come back with the type, with the images, and it really, these pixel fields start to occur more frequently. Here's an example, again, that behind that cougar is all digitized painting. On top of it, I painted by hand the pixels, which was kind of interesting. I didn't think of it at the time. It's actually kind of analogous to like Impressionism, sort of the breaking down of the image. I never would have thought of that. I was never, as a student, really a fan of Impressionism. There's nothing wrong with it. I wasn't into it. And then suddenly I'm doing this image where I'm hand painting pixels, and I'm like, oh my God, this is just like Seurat or something, which is, given my interest in the impact of technology, was kind of it it makes perfect sense that, of course, I would end up there, but it's kind of a funny revelation. So this painting was down in Arts West for a while, right, with Jim's show. And what I have here, so you saw the final painting. So this illuminates that process a little bit more. So what I did is I did the ground with the Van Halen stripes and the brown sort of overspray and the gold overspray. I got the car kind of mocked in. And then I took a photo of it and I took it in the computer because I was like, I've invested a lot of time in this and I need to make sure I don't screw it up in trying to finish it because it's a big, like 4-foot wide painting. So I laid this gray pixel field on top of it, figured out the color and the placement of that. I'm then able to take that from Illustrator, send it to my vinyl cutter, and it makes a nice big stencil for me. The type, I figured out the typeface and the color here. Again, send it to the cutter. And then what's funny is down here, this little thing here that looks kind of like the lens flare effect in Photoshop. It was just supposed to be a placeholder. It was just going to be like a cloud of white that then I was going to put these little line drawn, like, Hail Satan hands for metal. But I really liked how it looked in the image, and I liked that it might seem as a reference to Photoshop. So I then cut stencils that allowed me to replicate that. So the sketching what was possible in the sketching started to inform how I was able to do things in the paintings, which has been kind of fun for me. So here's the group of the 6 of them all together. Here's my 2010 show in Chicago. I'm going to go through these a little more quickly because we're all tired of being here. I'm sure I want some snacks over at the reception. Right? We're getting ready for snacks. I want some snacks at the reception. You can see, we'll talk about this over there. If you have questions about any of the work that's there, you can chat to me about it. Show down in Bloomington. Again, I always like to include installation shots. If you're an artist, even if you're doing 2D work, you should always have some installation shots because when you're sending it out to galleries or for shows or things, it's really helpful for the person then to kind of understand how your work lives in a space. So I like it because it gives you a sense of the scale of the work, and because I'm interested in how they sort of communicate with one another, it's good, I think, to show a few together. Now I'm very familiar with this one. And this one, you're like, I'm sick of seeing that one. It's been here for weeks. And this one. So these are all on like 12-inch by 12-inch panels. A group of friends and I had a show together, and we decided we were all going to do the same size pieces that are the size of like a vinyl, like a record, vinyl sleeve. So we all did these 12-inch square paintings. It was all about like, we were all artists who use metal references in our work. I've also been doing some works on paper, pushing that, sizing up those kind of formal experiments that I started with the little works on panel, and again, pushing like the design and the patterning and the color as their own thing, but also as an opportunity to include more things in the big paintings. I do a lot of round paintings, actually, and it was really hard the first few times I did it because suddenly you don't have corners and it's like a totally different experience. But it's really interesting because it's different than a lot of work that you see, and it creates a whole other set of sort of formal challenges as you're working. So again, taking those sort of text and design pieces and trying them in some different forms. So this is actually sort of where the work's headed a little bit. You see how, again, I have to take baby steps. You notice how excited I was about the slight curving of the text during typeface. I've been thinking slowly about starting to incorporate more shaped panels that start to look like the kinds of digital forms that I'm using in the painting, so that the painting itself will be shaped like some of the digital forms and have more of that. And, so this is my little baby step where I basically took a square panel and cut the edges off. I know. If someone needs to talk to me about this before I leave, I'm totally open to it. Like, you can talk me off this ledge. So we've seen this one ad nauseum. Little installation view, but of course you know the installation view because you live it. And then these last few images are from my show I just had in Chicago last May. That's about the size of that painting. It's 45 inches by 60 inches. Again, using my tricks of bad JPEG, These bands, using these bands for the text is a little something I've been experimenting with, where the text maybe more firmly articulate their space, so they're not just sort of like inserted in a field, they start to create their own space that they're in. And then it's a little, my image is a little washed out here, but dealing again with that sort of z-axis in the digital world where things sort of tilt back into space. And you can see that in the big green painting. But again, that kind of algorithmic kind of space, that computational space. So I'm sort of pushing things into perspective a little bit more. That's the Sarlacc pit. It's called 1,000 Years. Does anyone know why it's called 1,000 Years? Star Wars fans? That's how long it takes to digest its prey. Boba Fett. Goes Sarlacc. So my show that I had in May was titled Too Dumb for New York City, Too Ugly for LA. And that's a reference. Does anyone know what that reference is? It's a Waylon Jennings song. So I decided if I was going to have a show that I had taken a Waylon Jennings title. It's a song that came up when I was working in my studio. I was like, that's like the best, that's going to be my next show title because that's great. Particularly for a show in Chicago, you know, like. So that's Waylon Jennings up there. And then, you know, a really interesting thing happened here based in color, and this is something else I'm planning on sort of pushing further. So I did this big stencil, and I knew I wanted to do a gradient that were the same colors that are happening, you know, in the image, in the sort of window behind the turkey and Waylon Jennings. So I decided, you know, thinking like it's almost as if this color moves across this painting, it only comes through in certain spots. So I did that gradient in the type, and in person, it looks like this in projection, but it looks like this in real life too. A really weird thing happens right here where that real hot pink and that real cool blue hit each other and start to merge, and it looks like it's vibrating when you're in person. Like it looks like it shouldn't, like that it's not real. And I'm interested in pushing that for like how I can use color in a way to create this experience that's almost like an actual screen. You know, it's sort of like a screen flicker or something that happens. And I would love to say like, oh, I figured out the ratios of color so that I could make it look like it. I didn't. It was just like kind of a happy accident that I'm excited to push further. Talked in the Painting 1 class this morning about a painting I did based on Darth Vader. That's that painting. And then I'll end it here with a few images of the show. Some works on paper. The one on the left is actually a screen print I did in a residency in Belgium in 2011. I spent 3 weeks there with a couple of friends. We did a bunch of collaborative pieces, and then we each did an edition of our own thing. And again, I'm not a screen printer, but they were both printmakers, so it was awesome. They just like told me what to do. And for all of our collaborative editions, I was basically like the quality control guy. There's a speck on that one. They're doing all the actual work, and I'm like, okay, no, I'll move it. Like they didn't let me do those editions. They let me print my own edition, but like the collaborative editions, they're like, no, why don't you just like help us get the paper in and out? And so I'm like, what's this squeegee thing? What's this do? So again, a sense of the scale of these. And then again, a bit of what's coming up on the horizon. So I have these sort of maquettes I've been working up. These are just, I built some panels, I took them into the shop, I cut them into shapes, I shaped them on the sander and things like that, just as a way to start to think about how this might play out. This could totally be a failed project. This could be something that I spent all this time on and it's gonna look terrible. I'd like to think in my head, I always tell students when they describe, I'm gonna do this, I'm like, yeah, it looks great in my head. But you know, do a sketch, show me some source material. So I'm doing that to you all now. I kind of like to think that because I've done the round paintings, like the transition will be easier because I'm kind of used to working with non-rectilinear shapes. I mean, these are rectilinear, but you know. And then also, very fortunately at Notre Dame, we have a really nice CNC router, and they had just set it up last year, and they're like, oh, we want everybody to use this. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna use it. So I designed some stuff up, and I'd actually planned on having like 3 or 4 of these in my show at the gallery in May, and I had some issues where the plywood I laminated, the plywood separated, the lamination separated, and there was no way to fix it, and I just didn't have time. You know, as an artist, as you all know, you are working against time. So that's my last image. We're at 47 minutes. I'm sorry, I went a little long. So thank you very much. So are there any questions? I mean, if we're all ready to go, you can also ask me questions over there while we're eating food. Or I'm happy to listen to any questions here if there are any collective. Yes, question? Was there a question?
I have a quick one.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between your small text panels
Mm-hmm.
and paintings? I mean, one feels like you nuance the idea of what you're trying to get at, the other one kind of seems easier to head with the text.
Yeah.
What are some of the response from your gallery and things like that?
I'm really lucky. I was saying this in the classes. I'm really lucky. My gallery is like awesome. Like he's really supportive, and I mean I'm not like selling a ton of work for him. I'm not one of like the artists that's helping pay the rent that much, but he still really supports what I do. So when I brought them in, he like didn't even bat an eye. He's like, oh great, because I knew I wanted to show them together. You know, I knew I wanted them to be sort of a chunk right when you went in the gallery, because I thought that it made sense to kind of be hit with that first. Because you go in the gallery and my show is on the left-hand side, there's another artist, another solo show on the right-hand side. And so I felt like it kind of helped to set up some of the formal stuff that was happening in that particular group of paintings. And it's funny, like I had pretty good responses from like, you know, fellow artist friends and even just people that night that I had never met, where they actually said that. They said like, it was really interesting to be sort of like hit with this like barrage of like color and type and shapes, and then it's almost like then you get into the rest of the big work, it's almost like those are almost like a little slower in a certain way because they're a little less, you know, there's something about that format and how packed they are with color and stuff without any images, that then in the bigger paintings as you see in the big green one in Artifact Transmission, there's a little more sort of open space in them, right? So I think what it did is it sort of like, some people saw it like almost like an introduction to the show, which I kind of liked, you know, this idea that you'd sort of like get a bunch of iterations of what then happens in the rest of the paintings. Did I do that here too? Yeah, I put the little text ones all together. Like for now, they seem like they need to sort of be together, particularly when they're in a room with, you know, a giant fluorescent green painting. Although I have been thinking about doing a bunch of the larger format of just the text and the design only. I'm a little like nervous about that because it seemed like, I mean, right, I got excited because I curved a block of text. Like I'm pretty measured and pretty meticulous in sort of how I advance the work in terms of what becomes possible in the decision making of the paintings. So what I need to do is just do a big one. And sort of get it out of my system so then it doesn't seem odd. So you can see in the fact that they're small, there's hesitation there, right? Like I'm still not fully, although I really like them, I think they're pretty effective, I'm still not like fully committed to them as like parallel part of the work. They still feel a little like not quite part of like the big paintings. So does that answer the question? Is that helpful? Yeah. Are there other questions? You're going to wait and corner me at the reception? I have a mouthful of food. Thank you. Thank you so much.